Hello, and welcome to episode 212 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perridan, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other assignments. How are you this morning, Bill?
Doing great, Seth. Getting settled in here in Cocoa Beach, Florida.
We've got an intriguing and controversial topic to talk about today. We've been asked several times as we've gone through our submarine episodes here in the last several weeks to talk about torpedoes, specifically American torpedoes, and why they sucked so bad. And they did indeed suck very, very bad. I know, Bill, you've personally spent a lot of time and effort into researching this topic, not just in your professional career, but in your professional career as a submariner, obviously, but in your post-Navy career as well, because this is something that, frankly, you could classify as a criminal act against the United States Navy submarine force, and not just the sub force either, but, you know, torpedo pilots, and especially in 42. Destroyers, crews too. It wasn't just sub torpedoes that were pathetic. It was all torpedoes that the United States Navy fielded in 41, 42, and for the vast majority of 1943. They were trash. Bill, lay it on us, man. How much harm did these Mark 14 torpedoes, and not just Mark 14s, but specifically the Mark 14s, how much harm did they cause?
Well.
Yeah,
so a lot. And you're right, Seth, that this is obviously a subject that every professional submarine officer studies during the course of their career. We still have some procedures and systems in place today that originated because of our torpedo failures in World War II. So every submarine officer understands them and learns about them. But in my post-Navy career, when I was a defense acquisition executive in industry, I would talk to government acquisition people and industry acquisition people both about the failings that led to so many sailors losing their lives in World War II. And like it or not, these failings during World War II were mostly on the side of the government, not on the side of industry. It wasn't industry, the producers of the torpedoes in industry or torpedo components in industry that caused these problems. It was squarely on the shoulders of the Navy people at the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance torpedo shop in Newport, Rhode Island, mostly, but not exclusively, Newport, Rhode Island, that ignored problem after problem after problem, causing Americans to die. And let me say that again. American acquisition people ignoring problem after problem after problem, causing American sailors to die. And that's why this is such an important topic to understand even in 2023. At the highest level, there are four problems that we were encountering from the very earliest days of the war. One had to do with the contact exploder that was in the torpedo nose, and we'll talk about each of these individually. One had to do with the magnetic exploder that was in the torpedo. So there were two different methods of causing the torpedo to go boom, neither of which worked. The third problem was that the torpedoes ran too deep, and that actually affected the magnetic exploder. And the fourth problem was that some torpedoes would run, after you fired it, would run in a circle and come back at the submarine that shot it. An airdrop torpedo that does a circular run, the airplane's not in danger. A surface torpedo or a submarine torpedo that does a circular run, the firing platform is going to be struck by the torpedo that they fired. And for those of you that watched our episode on USS Tang, this is going to sound familiar because it was happening with both Mark 14 torpedoes and Mark 18 torpedoes, the electric torpedoes. So that's kind of the introduction of the problems, and we'll cover the specific issues more fully as we go on. Does that kind of summarize it, Seth?
It does. And something I want to mention real quick before we get off of the circular run topic, and I know we'll visit it again, is that, there were 52 submarines lost in World War II, United States Navy submarines lost in World War II. We do not know how many submarines were lost due to a circular run. We don't. We know that Tang was lost. Go ahead.
And we don't know how many submarines put themselves in harm's way to get into firing position for torpedoes that didn't work. And of course, 14s are steam-driven torpedoes. You see the wake points directly back at the submarine that fired the torpedo. And so we don't know how many submarines were lost because the torpedo failed to go boom. And then in a counterattack, mostly by destroyers, sunk the submarine that was trying to conduct the attack. So submarines were launched for both reasons: faulty torpedoes that put them in harm's way, and because ACR or anti-circular run systems weren't installed and didn't work.
Right. And the famous circular run kill of the war, of course, is Tang, but we do know of at least one other circular run torpedo kill of the war, and that was on USS Tullabee. It was a submarine. She was a Gato class boat, SS 284. And the reason we know this is because on her fourth patrol, she fired a torpedo that did that very thing. It came back and boomeranged and hit her and sunk her. There was only one survivor, gunner's mate second class Clifford Kuykendall. He was the only guy that got out of the boat, and he was unconscious until he was rescued by the Japanese destroyer Wakatake the next day, and he served as a prisoner of war until the end of the war. But to that end, everybody thinks about Tang when you talk about circular run. There was at least one other one, Tullabee, and God knows how many more. We don't know. Yeah, we don't know. There may have been more.
Because if the submarines submerged at the time, they fire, an ACR will still hit it, and there's going to be no survivors. So we don't know, right? So the way these would manifest, though, is submarines would go out, and after the captains came to understand that the torpedoes were so unreliable, rather than conducting a textbook attack the way it should be conducted to minimize risk to the firing submarine, they would shoot, in most of which case it would require a salvo of torpedoes fired simultaneously. When you didn't know whether a salvo of if 6 torpedoes are going to work, what you end up doing is fire one torpedo at a time. Boom, that one didn't work. Fire another one. That one didn't work, because in a salvo, intentionally several are going to miss. That's the whole point of the salvo. It's to make up for uncertainties in firing solution. So you fire a salvo where intentionally some are going to hit, some are going to miss, but your probability to hit goes way up. If you don't know whether the torpedoes that hit are going to explode, you don't want to waste those torpedoes that you intend to miss in a salvo. So you end up firing one torpedo at a time, then another. And every time you do that, it increases the probability that you're going to be counter-detected. So in a case of, let's say, USS Tenosa, you fired 15 weapons individually, one at a time, 13 duds. The only ones that detonated, it was interesting, he brought this data back, were torpedoes that he didn't shoot using a textbook approach, which is perpendicular to the target. He ended up firing them at oblique angles, oblique angle to the target. And those 2 torpedoes did explode. He didn't know why, but he did know that those torpedoes did explode. And he said, you know what? I have better success when I throw out the textbook and fire trailing shots or bow-on shots at oblique angles those one have a higher probability of exploding than the ones that should explode, which is, perpendicular shots.
Right.
And that information was brought back and used to study the sources of failure.
The sub in question that Bill's talking about there, just for the guys, if you didn't catch it, it was USS Tenosa under the command of Lieutenant Commander Dan Daspit. That particular encounter that he's referring to occurred on 24 July 1943 when Tenosa encountered Tonan Maru number 3, which was a 19,000-ton Japanese tanker. He fired basically almost his entire inventory. The initial torpedo did hit and damage the tanker, drawing her to a stop, and she was basically just a sitting duck. And he fired one torpedo after the other that continually hit the side of the tanker and just went thunk.
We call them doink.
Yeah.
Doink. They bounce off and then sink. They don't explode.
Yeah. Frustrating to the nth degree. Had to be just criminal.
So let's start with why we had a magnetic exploder to begin with. I don't remember we've covered this before, Seth, but the most efficient way to sink a ship is to create a bubble underneath the middle of the ship where its bow and its keel and its stern are still buoyant, are still being suspended by the water, but the water amidships evaporates due to a detonation. And then the weight of the ship itself breaks the ship's keel, breaks its back. And it's actually the ship's own weight that breaks it. So what you have to do to create that bubble underneath the keel is explode the torpedo beneath the ship, not into the side of the ship. So how do you do that? Well, we had these torpedoes with magnetic influence detonators or exploders that when they sensed the magnetic hull, because obviously the seawater doesn't give you a magnetic signature, but there's a variability in magnetic signature when that torpedo swims under the hull of a steel ship. Mm-hmm. Once it detects that influence, that magnetic influence, then the detonator explodes and exploding the warhead, and you create that bubble, and then the ship sinks. Great when it works. It's also the point of the ship, of course, if you have a ship it's armored, like a cruiser or a battleship, nobody ever put armor plating on the keel of the ship. Mm-hmm. So you also are detonating the torpedo in the area with the least armor. So I'd like to tell you that the Americans came up with this concept first. We didn't. The Brits and the Germans did. And we acquired, I'll use that word, a German torpedo design and a Brit torpedo design. The first thing we did was classify our design. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's a common occurrence even today. We overclassified the design. And by overclassifying the design, even though we got it from the enemy, so who are we keeping the secret from? Not them, right? Right. Because they had the design already. We're keeping the secret from ourselves by overclassifying the design and limiting the design to people who only had the need to know. And this drove me crazy when I worked with the acquisition folks, because it was on active duty, because it's often the acquisition folks themselves who determined who had the need to know. And often the operational commanders were determined not to have the need to know on a highly classified design. The people who would be using the system wouldn't be allowed to know that it existed. And this would drive me crazy. Well, this happened in World War II with this torpedo design, with a magnetic exploder. The Bureau of Ordnance, BUORD, was reluctant to let sailors in the field tamper with it, lest they learn too much about the design itself and what was done. As a result, because of this need to know, they under-tested the design because they wanted to limit its exposure to people in the field. So only this is a table pounding moment right now. Only one test was conducted of the magnetic exploder. Against a derelict submarine, only 2 torpedoes were fired during that test, and 1 failed to explode, yielding a 50% failure rate based on 1 test, at least a 50%. And as the war would prove, it was a much higher than 50% failure rate. And I guess they decided this is where the phrase "good enough for government work" came into being.
You're not kidding.
Good enough for government work. We're 2 torpedoes fired, 1 exploded. Must be good enough. We're happy with them. And, and they basically put these torpedoes on shelves until they went to the fleet. The fleet didn't understand how they worked. We're told they're magic. Mm-hmm. Shoot them this way, fire them about, let's say, 3 to 5 feet under the keel of the ship that you're targeting, and you'll get a hit every time. And the fact that the Buord made that claim and believed that to be true was horrible. It turns out while the ocean itself doesn't have variations in magnetic signature, the Earth does. you go from one point spot on the Earth to another spot on the Earth, and the magnetic field of the Earth varies in such a way that it affected these torpedo calibration. And some torpedoes would explode without going under a ship at all, just based on the natural magnetic variation of the Earth's crust and mantle that occurs everywhere. In fact, we had to map this natural variation as we were building orbital satellites to know, how the satellite orbits would vary for particular navigational satellites based on fluctuations in the naturally occurring variations in the Earth's magnetic field. Well, though the first real practical implication we had that this was happening was when we had torpedoes that exploded when they weren't supposed to explode, and torpedoes that wouldn't explode when they were supposed to explode, precisely because we didn't do enough testing before we fielded these torpedoes, and we sent people in harm's way with these crap torpedoes that didn't work.
Consistently. Yeah. And the fact that they're going to withhold, that they being Buord is going to withhold information from the people that are going to do the shooting and dying, by the way, is typical bureaucratic red tape. Good God, you can't fix a problem if you don't know a problem exists, and even if you do know if a problem exists, you can't fix it if you're not allowed to try and fix it. So it's absolutely criminal, and it doesn't stop there. The magnetic exploder was one example, but that wasn't the only one.
Yeah, and by the way, if you listeners and viewers are getting the sense that I'm hoping a lot of defense acquisition officials watch this episode, you're right. I hope a lot of defense, because these things are happening today. Mark my word, these things are happening today, but because the program is overclassified, nobody knows about it. So we're going to get on to the contact exploder.
Yep.
Okay, so the magnetic exploder is the most efficient way to sink the submarine. But what if what if the ship doesn't have that substantial magnetic signature? For example, we fired some torpedoes at wooden ships that aren't going to have a metal hull, that don't have a significant metallic signature that you can target with your exploder. So you need a secondary exploder, which is the contact exploder. And what this is supposed to do is the torpedo goes bang into the side of the hull, triggering a firing pin, which explodes a detonator, which explodes the warhead. It's really supposed to be a backup, or it's the primary method for ships without magnetic signatures. But during World War II, even the contact exploder wasn't working. Mm-hmm. We would have torpedoes fire and the sonar, even you could sometimes even hear it through the hull. You were so close. You hear this thunk, and then the torpedo starts sinking and breaking up.
Right.
And so that was the second problem that had to be investigated.
So
the third problem that had, go ahead. I'm sorry. Jump in.
I was going to say that, the contact exploder was the main type of exploder that was used on aerial drop torpedoes. And
Right,
these are,
right.
we're talking about, TBD Devastators at Coral Sea and Midway, and then the Avengers at, Midway and Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, because we had piss poor performance from aerial torpedoes as well. These are your good old fashioned firing pin, slap on the side of the hull, kaboom, contact exploders. At least that's what they're supposed to be. And this is one reason why, in a lot of aerial attacks, Navy aerial attacks in 42 specifically, when torpedo squadrons would attack, they claimed a lot of hits, but they didn't get any hits. I mean, they got some, but it was very few and far between, because they watched the torpedo hit the side of the ship. And they could see the wake, they could see the fish running, they could see the thing hit the side of the ship. And when it does hit the side of the ship, more often than not, it will emit a splash. It won't emit necessarily the huge plume that you'll see when they go off, but it does make a kawoosh, when it hits the side of the ship. And if you're flying by at 200 and some odd miles an hour, and you see that, you're like, hey, we hit it, but they never did. So that's why a lot of torpedo hits from aerial drop torpedoes were overclaimed, because they legitimately thought they did hit, because they legitimately saw something hit the side of the ship, but it never went off.
Right. And some astute viewer is going to say, why did the Airedales have a better torpedo success rate than the submarines? And you're going to remember, I think we talked about in the Battle of Midway, where the TBDs would use something called a hammer and anvil attack tactic, where they come off of both the port and starboard bows and come in that way. That way, regardless of which way the target ship turns, it's going to be turning into somebody's torpedo, one of the airplane's torpedo.
Right.
What's interesting about the hammer and anvil tactic is predominantly those are glancing blows, where the torpedoes are coming in at an acute angle, not broadside. And just like the Tenosa discovered, I get a better success rate when I fire that torpedo at an acute angle, not broadside. The Airedales were experiencing the same thing for the same reason. And we're going to get to why here in a minute. So because it was a basic tactic to use this hammer and anvil approach method, if you're an airplane or squadron of airplanes, they were almost always firing at an acute angle, and they had a much better success rate than the submarines that were firing doctrinally at right angles.
And even then they were, and even then they weren't half the time.
Yeah, right, exactly. They still missed some. They still had impacts, but not detonations. That brings us to the wrong depth problem. So torpedoes routinely ran underneath the targets. Now this was different than the thunk, right? When the torpedo ran into the target, if the target's keel was deep enough, even though the torpedo was running deep, it would oftentimes run into the target. You would hear the thunk and then hear the torpedo breaking up. There are other times you hear the torpedo run, stopwatch is going, stopwatch is going. Okay, the torpedo is still running, but it should have hit the ship by now. It's still running. It's very clear the torpedo ran either past, fore or aft, or below. Guys would raise the scope, say, did we shoot at the right torpedo course? Did in the right heading? Yes, we did. The torpedo ran under the target. It should not have run under the target. We know what the keel depth is of that target. We set the torpedo depth appropriately. It should have hit that target. At very least, we should have heard thunk, not run underneath. So there was that. By mid-1942, the summary of all of this is by mid-1942, over 800 torpedoes were fired. 97% of the torpedoes failed to detonate.
That is unbelievable.
Because they either ran underneath, you got the thunk where it broke up, or ran at the wrong depth and the magnetic exploder failed to work. Admiral English, who was ComSub PAC at the time, said it was caused by the skipper's lack of aggressiveness. So let's blame the crews.
Yeah.
And this was an inexcusable moral failure on submarine force leadership. It's unimaginable that 97% of our skippers lack aggressiveness, right? Or 97% of our approaches. Every one of these approaches had multiple witnesses in the conning tower. The very detailed patrol reports were being written. We did something called reconstruction of the approach and attack. So we knew exactly how these approaches were being conducted. We knew which ones failed to be aggressive and which ones were aggressive. Guys like Mush Morton were having torpedo problems. And Mush Morton, the last thing you could accuse of Mush Morton of is lack of aggressiveness.
Yeah.
And still, Robert English was blaming the crew for these failures and refused to engage with WWII to get the problems fixed. Admiral Nimitz actually started engaging in 1942, before Admiral English died on 21 January 1943. Admiral English died in a commercial plane wreck in California, Pan Am plane, if anyone cares, in California. But Admiral Nimitz started the train moving in 1942 himself, because I don't think he believed English, his assertion that the crews simply lacked aggressiveness. So in January 43, when English dies, Admiral Lockwood is called up from Australia, where he'd been COM South Pac, and he's named COM Sub Pac. And he says, first thing we're going to do is throw away this overclassification nonsense. Screw that, was his exact words. We're going to fix this. He didn't believe that this was being caused by lack of aggressiveness. And so he was going to do something.
So to that end, while there were a lot of skippers who were lacking in aggressiveness, we've talked about a few of them here and there. There were plenty of skippers who had the aggressiveness that was so desired, and that would become commonplace, if you will, in the sub force in 43 and 44. Like specifically one, Howard Gilmore, Medal of Honor recipient. He was commanding submarines in 1942. He was conducting patrols in 1942. So, he didn't get the Medal of Honor just for being a good guy. I mean, he got it because, he was uber aggressive. So, I mean, the aggressiveness was there, but the torpedoes sucked. So it's, English's accusation that the skippers were not being aggressive enough, to a point you could think, maybe some of them weren't, but there were quite a few that were. So that immediately has to be thrown out. His comment has to be thrown in the trash.
That's right. Yeah,
absolutely.
So Lockwood, decades before the BOQ in Hawaii is called Lockwood Hall, Lockwood reports to submarine base Pearl Harbor to take over command of Sub Pac, and he starts work anew in this little white roof building that's still there at submarine base Pearl Harbor. Forgive me, I'm still going to call it Sub Base Pearl, even though it's officially not called that anymore. At the head of Piers 03 and 4, the building was still there when I was a junior officer. It's still there today. And it was still known as the torpedo shop, even though work was no longer done in torpedoes in that building. There's a sign there identifying it as such. And he requested permission, first of all, disconnect the magnetic exploder. Because let's take this out of the equation. These things suck. They don't work until we figure out how to fix this problem. What we need to do is rely on the contact exploder only, and then change depth of the torpedoes to ensure we're going to have contact on every shot. So that's kind of the first short-term fix. WWII said, no, you do not have permission to disconnect the magnetic exploder. And as if, WWII was forgetting who was in charge here.
Right.
And in fact, to make matters worse, they added little drops of blue paint to detect when the torpedo cover was removed, and to detect when sailors might have been going in there to disconnect the magnetic exploder. Yeah, sailors aren't that stupid.
Yeah.
What did they do, Seth?
Yeah, they just bought blue paint to cover their
tracks.
Yeah, CYA. I'm sitting here and I'm shaking my head, and it's not because I don't believe it. Unfortunately, I do believe it, and it's just it's the fact that you've got a guy in Lockwood, Admiral Lockwood, who is an experienced submariner in his own right. And he's, we've talked about this before when we had Admiral Fargo on. Lockwood used to go and talk to the skippers when not everyone, but most of them, when they'd come into Pearl, he'd go aboard their boat and say, okay, what happened? What worked? What didn't work? What's good? What's bad? All this stuff. So he was gleaning this information directly from the guys who were doing the job. And he's taking that information and he's turning and he's believing it. There was very little doubt on Lockwood's part. He's believing what these guys are telling him because they're out there doing it or trying to. And he's turning around and telling Buard this, and they're just refusing to accept it. And that's the thing that's so incredibly frustrating, is that you've got, I like to use the expression, when you've got 10 people telling you that you're drunk, you need to hand over the keys,
Right.
One of those kind of things. And this is a very similar situation. You've got not just Admiral Charles Lockwood, you've got the whole friggin' Pacific Fleet saying these things are trash. And Buard is sitting there going, you don't know what you're talking about. Shut up and use our equipment. And it's just, it's infuriating.
Now, a couple of examples come to mind even during my submarine days. We were given these systems called acoustic interceptors that were supposed to alert anytime there was an active sonar that might detect you. The sucker alerted constantly. You could be 1,000 miles away from the nearest ship, and this thing was going off. It was like, turn the thing off. It doesn't work. And we kept telling the acquisition folks, you've given us a piece of junk here. No, you just don't know how to operate it, was the response. Right. I know how these guys feel, is my point. Yeah, so, Lockwood did, actually, Admiral King, Lockwood flew to Washington after he got clearance from Nimitz, flew to Washington to defend the skipper, saying, this was not operator error. This is a torpedo problem. We need to disconnect the magnetic exploder. And King said, I agree, disconnect them. Again, we talk about King was right about almost anything, almost everything in one of our episodes in season 1. Here's another thing that King was right about, right? The Buard guys were there arguing strenuously that the operators of submariners didn't know what the heck they were talking about. And King said, I'm sorry, I believe the submariners. You go ahead and disconnect it. And they did. So that's how we started solving the detonator problem. So then Lockwood recruited a guy you may have heard of before. His name was Swede Mommsen. And Seth, remind us why we know this guy's name.
Well, he invented the Mommsen lung. The Mommsen lung was a really oddball kind of looking, Buck Rogers looking kind of a contraption, that was specifically designed to aid sailors escaping a sunken submarine. If you've heard the episode on USS Tang, this should ring a bell. It was somewhat successful, somewhat not successful. The design had good intentions, and when used properly, and that's the key word, when used properly, it did work. But it was created to help save American lives. Swede Mommsen was an innovator. He was a brilliant guy. And again, a highly experienced man. So he knew what he was talking about. So Lockwood definitely recruited the right cat to do these tests.
He was very technically astute. He was leader of the 1939 Squalus submarine rescue. He personally dove during that rescue, and he was now Commodore of Submarine Squadron 2. I was Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3. And so Lockwood said, Commodore, you're coming with me. And so he came out to Hawaii, and he was put in charge of figuring out what was wrong with the torpedo contact exploder problem. So one of the first things he did was led a series of live firing of torpedoes off of a cliff on an island that the Navy controlled back then. Actually, the Navy controlled this island through the 1980s and used it as a bombing range. The island's called Kaho'olawe, and I think that's the correct Hawaiian pronunciation from my 11 years in Hawaii. And so there was a cliff off of Kaho'olawe, and obviously an underwater cliff. And so we would fire torpedoes. This is horrible from the environmental standpoint, but this is the way things were done back then, into this cliff to prove that the contact exploders did not work. He also fired these torpedoes at a series of nets where we knew precisely the depth of the nets to prove that the torpedoes were running deep. They weren't running at the set depth, they were running deep because they would run underneath these nets. When he pulled the string on the depth problem, he discovered that when these geniuses at WWII replaced the exercise warheads when they developed the torpedo with a warshot warhead, which had real explosives in it, the warshot was heavier than the exercise warhead, and the geniuses didn't account for the differences in weight and bias the set depth upward or downward, actually, to cause the torpedo to run shallower, even though it was heavier with a warshot warhead in it. So that solved that problem. The short-term solution was to set the depth much shallower than you thought it was going to run. If you thought it needed to run at 10 feet, you would set it for 5 feet depth. And that was the kind of jury-rigged system to get it to run at closer to a proper depth, because it really took WWII guys rewiring the torpedo elevator circuit to fix that problem. And so that had to really be done by WWII. So that was solving the depth wrong problem. But the exploder problem, it took him some time to figure out. What Mommsen discovered was that he actually went on dives where he would find bits of the broken torpedo himself, and he'd find that the torpedo would break in two with the warhead split, and that the contact exploder, and by the way, if it sounds like it's not very safe, it wasn't very safe what he was doing here. That the contact exploder was built too ruggedly, way over-engineered for safety. Obviously, you don't want the torpedo to explode when it's inside the submarine.
Sure.
Okay, so you want it to be safe. But it was way over-engineered to the point where it wouldn't explode anytime, not just when it was inside the submarine, but anytime. So he started dropping torpedoes at sub-base Pearl Harbor with live exploder, but no warhead. He would drop them from a height and elevation of 90 feet using what we call today as a cherry picker onto a steel plate. And he found that 70% of the exploders did not detonate. So this is not good, Seth, is it?
No, it is not. And it's you got a magnetic exploder that is crap. And then you got a contact exploder, which works a little bit more of the time, but it still is not a consistent, producer. There's, we talk about movies here rather often, specific films relating to a topic we're talking about. There is a movie called Operation Pacific starring the Duke, John Wayne. And in one of the scenes, it's basically,
I think he's a JT in this movie, right?
I don't.
So
he's a
commander.
Commander, yeah, he's a commander. But
Yeah,
regardless of this, he's a sub skipper, or in the beginning of the movie, he's an XO, later becomes skipper, whatever. So it basically covers a lot of the different stories of the sub force in World War II in this movie that was made in the 1950s. One of the scenes in the movie is this: they're dropping torpedoes from a crane down onto a steel plate, trying to solve the contact exploder. And of course, miraculously, they solve it in 30 seconds in the movie. But it's relatively accurate in terms of they're experiencing these same type of problems throughout the first half of the movie. So if you want to, if you haven't seen it, check it out. It's a pretty good flick. It's not too bad.
Yeah. One of many that John Wayne played. He played every rank from, maybe they were expendable. He was a JG. So he's played every rank in the Navy, from JG to 2-star admiral in harm's way. Yeah. And every rank in between. Yeah, he got around. But what they learned when they dropped these torpedoes is that the firing pin would be distorted by a head-on impact. This is why the 90-degree perpendicular impacts weren't working. The spring was too strong. The pin wouldn't move into the detonator fast enough before the torpedo broke apart on impact. Ironically, a glancing blow, of course, caused less force, produced less force, hence it would detonate more often. So again, the short-term solution was throw the book out the window, fire the torpedoes without the magnetic exploder, bias the depth shallower than you really want it to be, and fire the torpedo at a glancing angle. Holy cow. Like nothing on this torpedo worked. And we had to jury rig everything to get the exploder to work. Now, in parallel with putting all that guidance out, which Lockwood did do, and the guidance started improving the success rate of these torpedoes. What Mommsen started doing is looking for the right kind of metal to build this firing pin out of so that it would be light enough to move back and forth, but strong enough to actually do what it's supposed to do. So Mommsen flies back to Buord in Newport, Rhode Island at one point, and he's let in on a bit of a secret. Here's the secret. Before the war, Buord asked some guy you might have heard of named Albert Einstein to analyze the physics involved with this firing pin. And Albert Einstein came to the conclusion that the firing pin would not work. And he recommended modifications being made to the design of the exploder. You get that? Albert Einstein gave the Navy recommendations on how to improve the design of the exploder. But the geniuses at Buord decided they were smarter than Albert Einstein. So they discarded his recommendation. They tabled him, they shelved him, used whatever expression they wanted, and ignored his advice. And Mommsen learns this. He exploded. The detonators didn't explode. Mommsen did. And he goes back.
Well done.
And he tells Admiral King that these buffoons resulted in the death of sailors, no doubt, right? Ignored the advice of the man who was widely considered the smartest human being on the planet. Mm-hmm. That's how stupid they were.
Yep.
And that's when Seth at the beginning of the episode said this was a crime. There's crimes, there's premeditated murder, and then there's, second degree murder.
Yeah.
This was premeditated. I won't call it murder, but this was premeditated.
Yeah.
People knew that the design was flawed and didn't do anything about it. Okay. There's a certain special kind of hell reserved for people who do things like this.
Yeah. I mean, so you're sending out submarines full of human beings to do an already risky job. Just being in a submarine anyway is a risky job.
Not a war. That's right.
It's a risky job, as evidenced by the multiple accidents that happened, and guys never got out. So you're sending guys that are already at risk to a hostile location, be it, off the shores of Honshu or Truk or where have you, putting them in the crosshairs of an enemy that desperately wants to kill them. Now, granted, Japanese ASW practice was not the best, but regardless, it did work more often than not.
Yeah.
And you're giving them improper tools. Now, it wasn't the boat's fault. We had great boats, Gato class. I'm drawing a blank. Vallejo class. Yeah. The Tambor. They're great submarines. Great submarines. Tench class. But they're all great submarines. But we still had piss poor weaponry with which to utilize those boats in a proper way. So I mean, it's nothing short of criminal activity here. And Bill, do we know of anybody who was actually prosecuted for this? I'm going to go ahead and probably assume no.
Nobody was prosecuted.
That's about right. Yeah.
No, and we could talk about that again, where the guilty parties were not prosecuted in the case of the USS Indianapolis.
Well, for sure.
Who knows when we'll cover that one. However, I think at this point the Buord people would have a little bit of humility. Mm-hmm. And they would go to battle stations to solve this problem. When Mommsen identified that we needed a different design for this firing pin, Buord said, yeah, redesign, 9 to 5 the way we work. This redesign's going to take more than a year. And of course, Mommsen said, people are dying today. Forget that. And that's probably not the exact word he used, but you get the idea. Right. And so he went back to Hawaii and he figured out that a modern metal alloy would work would do the trick, right? It would be light enough, yet strong enough. So it just so happens that there were some airplanes, crashed airplanes from the attack on Pearl Harbor. These are Japanese airplanes in like a junk pile in various places around Oahu. So he went to these junk piles of crashed Japanese airplanes looking for metal alloys that nobody recognized. And so this looks interesting. So he pulled some metal out of this crashed Japanese plane, went back and said to go into the sailor machinists. Every submarine has a machinist on board, and said, go to the lathe and turn this into a firing pin. Take this, whatever, bit of metal, put it on the lathe and turn it into a firing pin. And so they did. And he tested it with his drop test, worked perfectly. Mm-hmm. Not a year, we're talking weeks after he came back from visiting Buord. So it worked perfectly. He says, okay, now all I need is more crashed Japanese airplanes. Well, what do we have that looks like crash? Well, I wonder if they have anything over at Hickam, crashed American airplanes. And he went over to Hickam, and some Army Air Forces folks said, we got all these bent propellers from, hard landings and stuff like that. You think any of those will work? So you take also these bent propellers that can't be straightened out and used anymore in airplanes.
Right.
And so they start spinning firing pins out of damaged propellers. And of course, the Army Air Forces folks say, hey, contribute to the war effort. We'll give you every damaged propeller, every one we find. And so they did. They started making, and we put as many sailors on as many lathes, working 24 hours a day, something Buord was not doing, building firing pins until they had enough firing pins built that in late 1943, just 6 months after the cause of the problem had been detected, all submarines were loaded with a new contact exploder. Mm-hmm. Pretty amazing, Seth, if you ask me.
It is. And I mean, that's, we're bagging on Buord, but I mean, that's American ingenuity at its finest right there. When you're scrounging through junk heaps to try and find stuff to solve a problem that frankly, the people who should be solving ain't solving, and you have to do it your own self. So that's Swede Momsen deserves a lot of credit for saving a lot of lives on the American side of this particular issue, and that, the U.S. government wouldn't get off their duffs to get it done, but he made it happen.
The bureaucrats, right?
Yeah, the red tape people. Same cats who.
The Buord, the first word is bureaucracy. The Bureau of Ordnance. Underscore that word bureau, because it was a bureaucracy. It was not a warfighting organization. They did not have a warfighting mindset. And I find that's true in too many acquisition offices in DOD. And it's frustrating to me even today. Then so that leaves just the anti-circular run problem. This problem was actually fairly easy to understand and fix. It was a simple case of when the engines started, sometimes the rudder got stuck usually when the torpedo exits the torpedo tube, it starts turning to whatever torpedo course that's going to cause the torpedo to go to the intercept point. Man, right. I've hit that point home so many times. I hope our viewers understand. It's not going at the target, it's going at the intercept point. But it initially has to make a turn to get to that intercept point. Well, sometimes the rudder of the torpedo would go over and it would start making that turn and it would get stuck in that position. That was the problem. The short-term solution to the problem was always shoot at zero gyro angle. Zero gyro angle means aim the submarine at the intercept point so the torpedo doesn't have to turn when it exits the tube. That's the short-term solution. Again, it's jury rigging to solve the problem. The long-term solution was, making sure that the systems were more robust to reduce the probability that the rudder would get stuck, and then have even a second safety measure called an anti-circular run shutdown, ACR shutdown. And what that means is if the gyro of the torpedo would swing more than a classified number, I'll say it that way, but the gyro of the torpedo swings more than a classified number before the torpedo is gone downrange a classified distance, the engine will shut down.
Mhm.
So anytime the torpedo goes off heading from where it's supposed to go by more than, I'll make a number up, 60 degrees, the engine would shut down. That's called an anti-circular run, or ACR shutdown. So that was another safety measure that was built into the torpedo. So now we've got all those problems solved. Unfortunately, the ACR shutdown wasn't put into the Mark 18 torpedo early enough to help USS Tang and Dick O'Kane's boat,
Right.
and the crew that died on that circular run sinking.
And that's what I was going to ask is do you know offhand when that device was put in the fish?
I don't believe the ACR shutdown was put in torpedoes until too late to affect the end of the war.
Sure. Yeah.
The other fixes were put in place before the war ended.
Right. And the bottom line to all this is that something I mentioned earlier is, we lost 52 submarines in World War II. We do not know, with the exception of 2, Tang and Tullabee, that were sunk by circular runs. We do not know how many of our submarines were sunk by our own faulty torpedoes. We have no idea. And I don't think, until those wrecks are discovered, and, maybe, where they just found the albacore, several weeks ago, but are confirmed that they found the albacore,
Not far from Oahu, up in the La Cruz, as it turns out, right?
Right. Yeah. And, until those boats are found, and, maybe hopefully one day they all will be, you'll never know. But I would venture a guess with the really horrible performance of the torpedoes, and you have visual evidence, concrete proof that circular runs were a thing, that there were certainly more than Tang and Tullabee that were lost by circular runs. I'm not going to venture a guess as to how many, but I would guess that it was certainly more than 2.
Well, of the 52 submarines lost in the war, 20 of them were sunk before these torpedo issues were solved. So that means 32 after the 32 submarines were sunk. In theory, those 32 submarines had good torpedoes and were still sunk, lost to, aircraft, lost to, depth charges, and some, frankly, were blue on blue. And so, 20 of them, though, of those 20, how many of those could have survived had they had good torpedoes? But Lockwood said from the moment that Mommsen detected the cause of these failures, all major exploded problems suddenly disappeared. And Mommsen was not an acquisition guy. He was a fleet operator. And, to his credit, just wonderful job he did. And the team that supported him.
Yeah. It definitely, you got to wonder too, if those issues had been solved. Let's just play like the issues never happened, like they weren't an issue, like we had torpedoes like the Japanese did. And how much more damage would have been done to the Japanese by submarines, not just submarines either, by the way, destroyers, aircraft, whatever, and how many more American lives would have been saved and not lost because of faulty equipment. It's disgusting, really, when you think about it. It really is.
Yeah. So Mommsen was promoted to captain and awarded the Legion of Merit for the work he did to solve the torpedo problems, which was, incredible. That's a wonderful accolade for him. And things got better. But to your point, the point I guess, will close the way we opened. This was a crime conducted by Americans on Americans.
Yep.
And it should never have happened. The Japanese had perfectly effective torpedoes. The British, the Italians had better torpedoes than we did. And, just one of those things where we can't say it enough. Yep. And if I worry that something like this could happen today. Yeah. These systemic problems that lead to these kind of failures I'm not certain, I don't have confidence that these problems have been resolved in our 2023 acquisition world for the Department of Defense, not just Navy, all the services.
And the root of the problem is, I mean, all new weapons, all of them, be they aircraft, ships, rifles, machine guns, grenades, whatever, all new weapons have bugs. There's never anything that falls right off the factory floor and it's like perfect. They just don't. But the root of the blame lies in Buord's lap because of the fact that they just continually denied it, that they would not listen to the practitioners, and it turned a deaf ear and a blind eye to the mountain of evidence that was handed in to them. And they just they're the ultimate blame for this entire operation. Once the right people got in the right place, things began to happen. But it is, as we said, it is an absolute crime that it took, really, I mean, from December 7th, 1941 until the beginning of 44, really, for that problem to, be ironed out. And even then it wasn't ironed out completely. So, well, Bill, do you have anything else you want to add to this?
No, I think we covered this fairly extensively, Seth.
Yeah, I think you certainly laid it on us, and I do believe the viewers and listeners are going to like this one because we've gotten a lot of questions about this, and this was a masterful explanation on your part there, Bill.
I think that one of the things is when we beat on people, we really beat on them. People have said that about our MacArthur episode, and we're kind of beating on Buord today. But by God, the people we beat on, in my view, really deserve it. And I don't think history is kind of forgotten the degree to which they were culpable for the issues and problems that existed. And we owe it to the brave men, mostly men, in the submarine force, all men, and women that gave their lives for us, to not forget their culpability. So when people are guilty, we're going to beat on them.
And rightfully so. And this is definitely one of those occasions. So with that, we want to thank you very much for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of Pacific War podcast, wherever you receive your podcast. Give us a rating and review. Also, if you want to watch the video version of this, sign on to our YouTube channel called the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Like and subscribe. Please do like and please do subscribe to our channel. If you have a question, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. And once again, my name is Seth Perrin, and I want to say thank you very much. And Bill.
Yeah, Bill Tody, and we'll see you next time on the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast.